Well, I'd like to thank everyone at ASPO for having me here today, but we do have a lot to cover. What my talk will be about today is debunking the 100-year natural gas supply myth. All right. Okay, that wasn't. Oh, okay. Here we'll go with this. Thank you. Let's see here. All right. All right. The myth. As many of you know, the 100-year supply myth is something that's been one of the most talked about topics in American politics and the mainstream media over the last probably 4 years. Due to the commercialization and promotion of several shale gas plays in recent years, the importance of shale gas has become grossly overstated. I think we can all think of different types of hyperbole we've heard. And it now accounts approximately 35% of total gas production. And this is similar to offshore production, CBM, type gas, and early results have been grossly inflated. I think everyone here has heard, as Art talked about yesterday, that CBM at one time held great hopes that it would supply gas make the U.S. independent towards energy independence, as well as supply untold years and years of production growth, and that just hasn't happened. I think we're seeing something similar now with shale gas. So here are who is responsible? How did this come about? And I've identified a number of people in my book, that I call the shale gas promoters, the showmen, the charlatans, or whatever you might want to think of them. So I'll just read a couple of these. I think some of these are important to what I'll get to a little bit later. The shale showman. I say we're going to recover 400 trillion cubic feet. This was Boone Pickens on CNBC, April 28th of 2011. From Aubrey McClendon. In the last few years, we have discovered the equivalent of 2 Saudi Arabias of oil in the form of natural gas in the United States. Just to put that in gas terms and TCF, that's about 1,500 TCF of gas. So that is a very significant amount. From Dan Yergin, who I know ASPO has invited to in 2008 to have a debate about peak oil that he has graciously declined. The estimates of the entire natural gas resource base taking shale gas into account are now as high as 2,500 trillion cubic feet, with a further 500 cubic feet in Canada. 500 trillion cubic feet in Canada. That amounts to more than a 100-year supply of natural gas. That's a very large number to say that North America has a 3,000 trillion cubic foot resource base, but that was in the Wall Street Journal in 2011. And from Dr. Terry Engelder, who I've had a number of conversations with as research for my book, this calculation yields a 50% probability the Marcellus will ultimately yield 489 TCF. And that was pretty interesting because about 16 months earlier, Dr. Engelder put out a paper that that was published that suggested the Marcellus would only be about 50 TCF, and I asked him. I said, "Well, how did you get to 489?" And he gave me a pretty bizarre answer in that he had taken decline curve data from slides of about 50 wells from publicly traded companies' investor presentations, and I said that was and I said that's a pretty big leap, and he said, well, I used a slightly different model on how to go from 50 to 489, and I didn't quite buy into his explanation. So there's other people who have promoted the 100-year supply myth. Industry-sponsored gas studies, MIT, who thanks the Hess Corporation for supporting their study of natural gas. Penn State, which has had recently been in the news for a lot of academic integrity issues, as well as other issues that are beyond the scope. Navigant Consulting, as well as the Potential Gas Committee. And one of the things I found out about the Potential Gas Committee was was how it got started. I had always wondered, how did these people at the Colorado School of Mines one day decide, well, we want to study natural gas? And it was a book that was published about 15 years ago by Bud Lawrence, who was the chief lobbyist for the American Gas Association. And in his book, it's more of a memoirs and a lot of stories about him and playing golf and cards and lobbying in Washington for years. But there is a story on how the Potential Gas Committee came up. And part of it was, this is a time when gas prices were regulated, and the industry was always asking Congress for higher prices for obvious reasons. And they had to come up with different studies to say, well, we have plenty of gas out there we just need a little higher prices to get it out of the ground. And in his book, he completely comes out and says, well, we need to define some academic institution to give the appearance of objectivity. And that's how the Potential Gas Committee got started. And while I think they do a very good job of collecting data and coming up with a number, like everything else, it is the world in which we live. So government has also been responsible for the 100-year supply myth. Despite the recent reductions in shale resource estimates, which we'll get to in a minute, the EIA still vastly overstates future recoveries from shale plays. And then finally, the president, we have a supply of natural gas that can last America nearly 100 years, and that was in the State of the Union earlier this year. So let's talk some real numbers, because I think that's really what it is important to put some real numbers behind what we potentially are going to get out of the ground. So in July 2011, the EIA estimated that the technically recoverable resource would be 862 TCF, with including 410 from the Marcellus. That was, and then in January of this year, I believe that number should read 750 from a study that was put out with that was coordinated with Intech. However, the 862 I got from their annual energy outlook that was published earlier in the year. And then in January of 2012, they reduced it to 482 TCF, with 141 coming from the Marcellus. So that was a 42% reduction in 6 months, largely due to a decline in the expected recovery or expected total resource from the Marcellus. So are these realistic? My answer would be absolutely no way. Now let's consider the following. For 141, TCF, you're looking at that's a very large number. That alone is between 6 and 7 years of U.S. supply. So the vast majority of the Marcellus acreage remains unproven. The drilling has consolidated to 2 relatively small core areas, one in the southwestern corner of the state and one in the northeast central part of the state. And to date, the Marcellus has produced about 3 TCF. But one of the things that I have found, researching this is it's very difficult for most people to understand how big a field 141 is. And when I came across a study, and I didn't really have an idea myself until relatively recently, and I found a study by the Kansas Geological Survey that was done in 2006. It's called the Hugoton Asset Management Project. And they looked at how can they get the most out of the Hugoton. And they looked at all the other big fields in the world. Most of them were in Russia as well as the Middle East, and they found that the Hugoton has produced 35 TCF over 70 years. That is the biggest field in North America by a fairly significant margin. And that is by production history. That isn't by estimates. That isn't by someone's opinion. That is actual production. So when you think of the Marcellus, it is a big field. It's going to produce a lot of gas, but is it 4 times to 5 times the size of the Marcellus or the Hugoton? That's a pretty big leap. So the Barnett Shale, what do we know from what we've produced so far? Produced 11 TCF of gas from nearly 17,000 wells since 2001. The prospective area has shrunk down to 4 counties. So even if we say 25 TCF of future recovery, whereas the EIA thinks it will recover, has total resource of 43. The Fayetteville, this is, the Arkansas Oil and Gas Commission has a fantastic amount of data out at their website. It's section B43 is the where you can go to find the they're out there, and you can see basically what has been produced so far. And so far it's been 3 TCF from 4,000 wells. The EIA comes out with a 32 TCF estimate. The Haynesville has been covered a lot here, so shrunk down to basically DeSoto Parish and surrounding parishes. An optimistic estimate would be about 12 TCF based on around 4,000 or 5,000 wells and about 3 TCF, 3 BCF per well of recovery. And this number was found by Art Burton, came to that conclusion, as well as 2 researchers from Louisiana State University, Mark Kaiser and Yunke Yu. Both have come up with, both studies have come up independently with about 3 BCF per well. So if we just average that out and multiply that by the number of, an estimate of locations, you get well south of what the EIA considers technically recoverable. And lastly, the Antrim Shale. And this is a very important shale, even though it's not hydraulic, and even though it's not been horizontally drilled or hydraulically fractured, has produced 3 TCF of gas from 10,000 wells between 1989 and 2010. Production has fallen every single year since 1998. So this is now, we're looking at over 13 years of declines. So, the Michigan Public Service Commission has puts out this data on their website. However, the EIA comes up with about 20 TCF of future technically recoverable resources. And I think that is prima facie evidence of that the EIA, it would be very difficult to justify that since we have well over 20 years of production history. We have a clearly defined aerial extent of the play, and production has been going down every year for over a dozen years. So to me, this is a wildly optimistic 20 TCF. So if you add it all up, we get to about 127. While Scott Tinker had mentioned earlier, my estimate is certainly going to be wrong, but even if I'm wrong by 100%, and I'm using some fairly optimistic projections, considering the Eagle Ford hasn't produced 1 TCF, and as well as considering production from other plays that are currently not under development, to get to 127. So why are prices so low? Hedges were talked about earlier. Hold by production drilling, thousands of uneconomic wells have been drilled in the last 3 years. Technology, the wells that we drill today are far longer and have far more fracture stimulations than we do 2, 3, 4 years ago. So comparing apples to apples, as far as if we were to do that, we would see on a per frac basis, we would see substantial declines in productivity. Drilling for liquids-rich natural gas, many wells drilled in the Barnett as well as the Eagle Ford are now producing gas that up until recently were economic, but due to the drop in the price of liquids, they have really had their economics damaged over the last couple years. And then joint ventures with other foreign companies. This is one of the biggest things that I think has caused the price of gas to be so low, over the last 3 or 4 years, has simply been about 30 to 40 billion or so that has come into the United States and Canada, and now these companies are now backtracking. For example, Total, which just spent $4 billion getting into the Utica with Chesapeake, and they also had another earlier adventure with them in the Barnett. They are now not interested in spending any more money in North America to go chase shale gas in China and Argentina, 2 places that don't have any shale gas production. We've seen massive write-offs at BHP, BP, BG Group of the UK, all have written down substantially their shale gas, and I think more is coming. And then really, lack of perceived scarcity. This is another, markets are funny animals, and when they perceive gas will stay low and stay at a price that is below the cost of production, that is clearly that the market believes that there is an unending supply of cheap gas. So where do we go from here? Obviously, the rig count has dropped, and it may flatten out from here. If prices do move up, I don't see it going too much lower. We will return to the historical production of 10 to 1. We are now at 20 to 1 approximately. It had gotten as high as, as 3 standard deviations from the norm earlier this year. LNG exports, we haven't talked about that, and imports. I think exports are a profoundly bad idea since the U.S. is not self-sufficient in natural gas. We still import 5 BCF a day from Canada. For another discussion, I don't believe LNG imports will also make much difference when prices do rise. And declining imports from Canada. The U.S. has a long history of importing cheap gas from Canada. This is coming to an end due to increasing demand industrially from the oil sands, as well as the exports to Asia, which will begin in 2014 from Kitimat in British Columbia. And then basically, one last myth that we'll go over is the connection between prices rising and drilling picking up, but production declining. This is something that is very difficult to explain at times. Simply, in 1973, we saw gas prices go between 1973 and 1984 go up 12-fold. We saw the rig count more than double, and production decline substantially. This happened again in 2001 to 2007. Prices went up more than 50%, the rig count went up more than 50%, and production went down. So there is not a clear connection between economic increases in the price of gas and new production, and I think we're going to see another period where this phenomenon is about to occur, where we will see a pickup in drilling and declining supply. And then where do we go from here? Sometime between 2013 and 2015, if we continue on the same path, we will see gas prices move to at least world prices, which would be somewhere between $12.50 and $15. High prices will be very damaging to the economy. This will increase food prices, electricity prices, home heating prices, and cause further consumer confidence to decline. And then lastly, the wailing and gnashing of teeth will begin. So that's all I have.